Welcome to the second video on IFS, or internal family system, as a therapeutic approach. In this video, I want to focus on the principles underlying IFS therapy. And for this, we're basically going to look at this. What are the principles or pillars that underlie the process or the approach of IFS therapy we've looked at in the last video? Before we dive deeper into the actual principles, I first want to look at the question of what is a principle? Because I think it is important to understand what I mean by that word. So a principle is a fundamental truth or perspective that underlies a certain system of behavior or reasoning. And I think here we can beautifully insert clinical reasoning. So one way to look at principles is that a principle is something that informs our actions and our thinking. So whatever might be happening in a session with ourselves, a client, a patient, the principles are what align and inform and orient our thinking and acting towards whatever is happening. So I think by focusing on the principles first, it's much easier to then go into the step-by-step process, the 6 Fs, the unburdening process, and have a sense of why each of them is in place. So that's why I want to focus on the principles first. And you can basically say that the principles we're going to explore are what underlie the process we've looked at in the last video. That's why they're symbolized by these pillars. They are what the process rests upon. And the 7 or 8 principles I'm going to look at is the major guiding principle of lead sessions from self. Whether you work with yourself, you work with anybody else, make sure there's as much self present as possible and you really act from there. The fundamental and very basic principles of all parts are welcome, especially important in the beginning of the therapeutic process. Parts are intelligent and you can interact with them. All parts have a positive intent, and parts are not their burden. All of these principles really inform how we interact with whatever shows up in a session, whether it's a resistance, whether it's a part that doesn't want to go along, whether there's a specific memory coming up. We interact with that. We welcome it. We treat it as intelligent and as if we can interact with it and learn about it. We say, this has a positive intent, and we try to find out what that is. And we always know that parts are not their burdens, so we can negotiate with them and actually talk about, hey, do you want to continue doing this? Now, these basic principles are most important in the beginning of a session. They are most informative there. They stay important throughout the whole session, but this is where they're really the focus. Now, as we get towards unburdening exiles and releasing protectors from their roles, there are 2 additional principles that are very important to orient towards, and that is to change the system, we need more self and less vulnerability. That's a very simple underlying orientation on how change can happen in the inner world. The more self, and thus resources we have, and the more less vulnerability we have, the more possibilities we have. And self is the agent of healing, meaning we don't have to fix everything. We don't have to try everything from our mind or strategies, etc. Self is the agent of healing, and self is the agent of healing in every single client and patient. And then, as we get towards the step of self-leadership, the principle is self is equipped to lead the system, which is a very fundamental trust in the self in every single human we interact with, that they are equipped to lead this system and that they are best equipped to lead this system. So after having given you a rough overview of the principles, I want to walk through each one of them one by one to give you a bit more of an understanding of what this principle points towards. And we're going to start with lead sessions from self. This is pretty straightforward, but it reminds us as coaches, as therapists, as people working with ourselves, self is the deepest resource we have. And by really making sure that we are present, that we are connected, that we are in self, we connect to that resource. If we are working with somebody, by us making sure that we are in self, we can open a whole field of self, which actually influences and impacts the person sitting across from us, the person we're working with. The more self is present here, the easier it is for the other person's self to be there. And also, the more a coach or therapist is in self, meaning open, curious, compassionate, etc., the more parts will relax, because they can feel that somebody's there who's genuinely there, somebody who doesn't want to change, somebody who's open, who wants to learn. And that just changes the whole dynamic in comparison to trying to fix somebody or trying to move as quickly as possible. So principle number 1, lead sessions from self. Principle number 2 is all parts are welcome. I think this is one of the first sentences anybody will hear if they do a training, a workshop, or something similar in the internal family system cosmos. All parts are welcome. This is the very foundational, basic attitude with which we approach and interact with whatever is happening. So whatever is happening, whatever part is showing up, whether it's angry or against what's happening or scared, it's welcome. Full stop. We don't push any part away. We don't make any part wrong. The basic attitude is there are no bad parts. There are no parts that want harm. All of these parts have a positive intent, and some of them might be scared. Some of them might actually be challenging, but the best way we have to dealing with that is welcoming them. So we welcome the parts, we acknowledge that they're there, that they are trying to do something good, and we explore why they're showing up right now, what they have to show us, what they're worried about, what they need, etc., etc. And also in this welcoming all parts, we are already welcoming them, but we're also acknowledging them as parts, which allows to welcome the part, but then also to make sure, hey, is there a possibility to unblend? Is there also a possibility to have self present? So principle number 2, all parts are welcome. Principle number 3, parts are intelligent and you can interact with them. So at the beginning of a session, we try to be connected to self, in self. All parts are welcome. And if a part shows up, we trust that they're smart, that they're intelligent, and we can actually communicate with them. So by relying on this third principle, if a part shows up, we think, hey, it probably has a reason. I don't know the reason, but I can find out. I can ask the part question. I can figure out why it's doing things, why it has been probably doing these things for a very long time. And I trust that parts know stuff that I don't, that the patient or client doesn't, but that this part can show us these things. So parts carry specific memories. They know about other parts that might be dangerous, very strong firefighters, etc. And through them showing up and us welcoming and interacting with them, we can learn those things and we can actually give better sessions, work with ourselves better by including these parts. So that is principle number 3. Parts are intelligent. You can interact with them. You can ask them questions. And through that, you can actually learn things you don't know yet. And principle number 4 is one I've mentioned a lot in the past videos as well. Principle number 4 is parts are not their burden. And this is so important in how we interact with parts. Because if we assume that parts are their burden, meaning a protector is its role, an exile is its pain, then we don't assume that they can change. Then we don't assume that they might hold qualities that we don't even know about, but we assume, oh, this critic wants to criticize. That's what it does. That is what it is. This scared part is just scared. That is what it is. But the IFS perspective is no, that's not true. Actually, parts are not their burden. Whatever they're carrying, the role they have, in the case of protectors, or the pain they carry in the case of exiles, is not what they originally carried. It's not the original quality that this part had, but it is what it took on through the burden. In the case of protectors, they usually do not want to do what they're doing, which also means not just can we help them change, but we can negotiate with them. We can say things like, hey, how would it be if you didn't have to do this anymore? And parts are really open to that. And also, we can see that they can change and release things. These parts can change. So rather than parts having to die, or us having to get rid of parts, or making them smaller, etc., they can transform. They can release what they're carrying, and they can reconnect to their original qualities or to different qualities. And this is actually a change. So that's what's contained in this principle, that parts are not, let me make this clearer, are not their burden. Parts are much more than their burden, and that's just something they're carrying or doing, but something they can also release. So that was the first batch of principles, and I want to go into the drawing again. Basically, we covered these principles. The lead sessions from self is very true for everything, but especially these are so important as we learn to work with protectors, as we do the basic first steps also with exiles. These are really the main principles that guide our action, that we use to inform us. The deeper we get into also seeing how we can help the system change, realign itself, we need a few more principles, and that's what we're going to look at next. Principle number 6 is to change the system: more self, less vulnerability. Basically, this means that there are two forces that help the whole system reorganize and realign itself. And the first one being self. The more access we have to self and self-energy, the whole system can realign itself. When there are these deep resources, these states of being in which certain problems just don't exist anymore, the system can transform itself. The more parts are aware of self as a resource, as a quality, as someone, something that can be there and that can actually help them do the tasks they're often so overwhelmed with, the more they can trust that, the more they can relax a little bit, the more they can allow that self to be there and take on these jobs. So more access, parts more aware of self, allows change in the system. The second thing that's really important for change in the system, though, is not just the self, not just this, but it's also a reduction of the vulnerability and the charge in the system. So the more we can help exiles let go of some of the old pain, the old burdens, that will make the system much more stable, because right now the protectors are working so hard and often using strategies that are very old and that they don't actually enjoy doing, because the exiles are carrying so much charge. So if exiles are unburdened, if the charge is less, they don't have to do what they're doing to the same degree anymore. So reducing vulnerability will allow the protectors to let go of some of their roles and to relax more. Another way this can happen is that there is less charge around exiles. I've found that with some clients, this transformation could happen before exiles were even transformed or unburdened, just by the system realizing that yes, this exile was once incredibly overwhelming, but it isn't anymore. I can actually hold it now. From self, I can be with this exile, and thus the exile becomes more included into the system. It may still not be the best or most pleasant part to be connected to, but it doesn't have to be kept out of awareness as drastically, and that less charge around the exiles can really change a lot about the system as well. So those are the elements of to change the system: more self, less vulnerability, and the different forms how this can take place. Principle 7 is self is the agent of healing. And this is a very general principle. It's kind of a mission statement, but also a fact. In every human, the agent of healing, or the agent that is most capable of helping and healing the parts, is the self. This principle says that's the case in everyone, no matter how dysregulated the system may be right now. So the assumption is that no matter what happened, no matter how intense a system is, self is always whole. We might not have much access to it, but self is there, and self itself is not broken or hurt or damaged. The self is there, and the self, if it can be present, can be the agent of healing. This means it is the self and as the agent of healing in every single client themselves. We try to support people in doing as much of their own work and as much of their own healing as possible, because that is the most powerful way, and it's actually the most transformative way for the system as a whole. The more the self in each person heals the system, transforms the system, the more it can last, and the deeper the trust of the system into the self can get. So self is whole. Self is the agent of healing in each person. And actually the connection to self is already healing for many parts. Once they realize there is a self, and it's always potentially there, that can change the way those parts relate to everything. This is especially true for exiles, but it's also true for protectors who realize, I don't have to do this job as hard as I have. So self is the agent of healing. And that was the second batch of principles. This was these two that really relate to the foundation of transformation and of change in the IFS system. And to end this video, I want to now look at the last principle, which is all about self-leadership. And the principle is self is equipped to lead. Self is a capable and the natural leader of the inner system. And this is, again, such a powerful perspective, but basically this is a fundamental trust in every human being. And no matter how disorganized a system is that might be sitting across from me or you, no matter how little access this human has had to self their whole life, the basic trust is self is equipped to lead. It may not be an easy road. It may not be like that. But self is equipped to lead. That's the fundamental trust we have in the power of self in every single person. We would even go as far as saying it is the natural state of the system for self to lead, for self to negotiate, for self to connect to the parts. Self is the natural leader of our inner system. And when that's our orientation, and we have trust that that is true, and we have trust that self can heal, and we know that once the vulnerability goes down and self goes up, the system can change. And we know that the parts actually want that too. And that all those parts that are super active right now, they do have positive intent. And they can change. And they are intelligent. Then it's so easy to welcome them all. So in one way, all of these principles come back together to the core of how we are with others, how we are with people that we want to support, how we are with ourselves and the places where parts of us need help. That's what all these principles point to. And that's what really the way of being with humans is, as we are working with them using this perspective. It's the end of this video. I hope you found this video helpful. If you enjoy it, please feel free to share it. It really supports me. And see you in the next video.
You never know what's around the next corner. So.